The galaxy was a cold and unforgiving place. Humanity had learned that lesson the hard way when the Trathans arrived with their war fleets and overwhelming might. They had obliterated Earth without a second thought, tearing apart the cradle of humankind and scattering its people like dust across the stars. Captain Sarah Holt knew that Earth was gone, but she refused to believe humanity was finished. She stood on the observation deck of the command center, overlooking the small colony that had become the last refuge of her kind. The planet was desolate, a barren world that had once supported life, but now only the survivors of humanity clung to its surface. The Trathans had no idea it was here, but that wouldn't last forever. They never did understand what drove humanity, or why they fought so fiercely against overwhelming odds. Holt could feel the weight of responsibility heavy on her shoulders. She was their leader, the last bastion of humanity, and she would do whatever it took to ensure their survival. Her eyes swept over the few remaining human ships scattered in orbit above the colony. Each one was a testament to the ingenuity and perseverance of the human race. Their designs were outdated, their technology inferior when compared to the Trathans, but they had one thing the aliens didn't: a spirit that refused to break even in the face of annihilation. Holt clenched her fists. She couldn't let the Trathans win. She couldn't let her people fall into the grasp of another alien empire. After all humanity had been through, they deserved to survive. The silence in the room was broken by a soft chime from the communications console. Holt turned sharply, her mind already racing through the possibilities. The message was encrypted and flagged as urgent. A sense of dread crept into her stomach. She crossed the room and activated the console with a swift motion. The face of her second-in-command, Lieutenant Marcus Yarrow, appeared on the screen, his expression tense and grave. "Captain, we've detected an incoming fleet Trathan size, and it's heading straight for us." Holt's blood ran cold. It was happening. The Trathans had found them. Their hidden colony was no longer safe, and their options were running out. She steadied herself before responding. "Where are they now, Marcus? Can we intercept them?" She could hear the sound of Yarrow's breath as he glanced down at the readout. "Captain, their fleet is only a few hours out. We don't have the firepower to stand against them, not with the resources we have left. We'll need to buy time to evacuate the civilians." Holt's heart sank. She knew they didn't have the luxury of a full-scale evacuation. The Trathans would be on them too quickly. They couldn't afford to run. They had to fight. Holt took a deep breath and set her jaw. The first step was to ensure the colony's defenses were ready. Their weapons might not match the Trathans, but they would make the enemy pay for every inch they took from them. She glanced toward the far wall where a schematic of their most precious secret was displayed. It was time to reveal the only card they had left: the Aurora, the legendary ship built long before the war. It was humanity's last hope. But there was one problem: it had never been tested, and no one knew if it could still fly. She turned back to Marcus. "This is it. We make our stand here. Prepare the crew. We're going to need every fighter we have left." She could see the uncertainty in his eyes, but his nod was resolute. "Understood, Captain. It's all we have left. The Trathans won't know what hit them." Holt smiled grimly. She was about to show the galaxy exactly what humanity could do when cornered. The countdown began in the control room, each second stretching into eternity. Holt stood at the center of the chaos. Officers and soldiers rushed around her. Final preparations were being made for a battle that felt impossible. The crew of the Aurora had been assembled in record time. Most of them were young, untested. But they had one thing that none of the Trathans could match: heart. Their resolve was unbreakable. And that was enough for Holt. As she walked to the door of the command center, she could hear the hum of the ship's engines powering up. The Aurora was alive. The ancient vessel hadn't flown in decades, but it was ready now, and for the first time in a long while. Holt felt a glimmer of hope. She looked at her crew gathered around the launch bay. All eyes were on her. They waited for her orders to lead them into the unknown. She wasn't just their captain, she was their last chance. Every face before her held fear, but also something else: defiance. It was in their eyes, and it was in their hands. The weapons they carried, the tools they would use to fight back. She gave a final nod to Lieutenant Yarrow, who stood beside her. He gave her a brief salute before turning to the crew. He had been through this before. They all had. The last time humanity faced such an enemy, they had been unprepared. They had been divided. But now they stood together, united by the last hope for their species, the last bastion of humankind. And they would make sure the Trathans would never forget the fight of the humans. Holt climbed into the command seat of the Aurora, her hands trembling for the first time in years. But she pushed it aside. There was no room for hesitation, not now. The ship's main console flickered to life, and a voice she had longed to hear rang out, "Captain, all systems are online. The ship is ready." She nodded once, signaling the signal to launch. The doors of the hangar opened, and the Aurora slid into space, the cold void surrounding them. As they moved into position, her ship was small compared to the Trathan fleet, but it had an agility that would make it deadly if they could use it right. Holt's heart pounded as the ship broke away from the station, but she held firm. It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. As they passed the edge of the colony's protective perimeter, Holt could see the distant silhouettes of the Trathan warships, closing in, each one larger than the last, their black hulls gleaming ominously in the light of the distant star. The weight of the situation pressed on her shoulders, but she knew this was what they had prepared, for there would be no retreat. They would either fight to the end or die trying. Suddenly, alarms blared across the ship. The Trathan fleet had entered firing range, and the first wave of enemy fighters was breaking off the main force heading straight for them. Holt's voice rang out, cutting through the panic on the bridge. "All hands prepare for battle, shields up, ready, all weapon systems." She turned to Yarrow. "Now was the time. Make them regret underestimating us, Lieutenant." He gave her a quick nod of understanding. The ship's weapon systems came online with a deafening roar of energy pulses. The first enemy ships fell into view, fast-moving and heavily armed. But Holt had a plan. She trusted her instincts and the capabilities of the Aurora. She'd spent years studying this ship's design and knew its strengths better than anyone. Suddenly, with a smooth motion, Holt sent the Aurora into a sharp dive. She aimed straight for the heart of the Trathan line, weaving through their fighters at breakneck speed. The enemy scattered to avoid her, but it was already too late. The first salvo hit its mark, a direct hit on a Trathan warship that exploded in a burst of light. The crew cheered briefly, but Holt knew better. This was only the beginning. They had to stay focused. The battle had just started. The explosion of the Trathan warship sent shockwaves through the ranks of the enemy fleet. They had expected a quick victory, not this kind of resistance. The Trathans were quick to regroup and launched a more coordinated offensive, targeting the Aurora with renewed fury. Holt gripped the controls of the ship, her knuckles white, as the ship swerved to avoid the oncoming fire. The Aurora was fast and agile, but it was still vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The first wave of enemy fighters swarmed them like a pack of wolves, closing in on their prey. Holt's mind raced through the countless scenarios she had studied back in the command center. There was no way they could engage in a prolonged battle. They had to strike fast, hit hard, and then disappear into the chaos or risk being destroyed before they had a chance to do anything else. She turned to her crew. "Move us into position now," she barked, her voice steady despite the rising tension. Lieutenant Yarrow was at her side, his hands dancing across the console as he locked onto the nearest enemy fighter formation. "Captain, we have incoming missiles from 3 ships on the left flank." Holt didn't hesitate. She slammed her fist onto the ship's firing console. The Aurora's cannons fired in rapid succession, the blasts tearing through the enemy ranks. The missiles exploded into the surrounding ships, their metallic frames crumpling under the force of the energy bursts. Still, the Trathans came in greater numbers. They were relentless. Holt's heart pounded as she swerved the ship in a series of impossible turns, evading fire from the enemy fighters. But she could feel the strain of the maneuvering on the Aurora's systems. The ship was old, and the stress was beginning to take its toll. "Captain, we're losing shields," Yarrow called out, his voice tight, the pressure mounting. Holt's eyes narrowed. She wasn't about to let her crew go down without a fight. "Give me everything we've got," she ordered. "Thrust all power into the weapon systems. We'll break through their lines." Holt's grip on the controls tightened as the ship accelerated at full throttle. The Aurora was no longer moving like a ship. It was a predator hunting its prey. The enemy fighters scattered as she plowed through them at lightning speed, leaving trails of wreckage in her wake. But they were far from finished. The main Trathan warships began to reposition and focus all firepower on the Aurora. Holt's teeth gritted as another barrage of laser blasts raked across the hull. A ship shuddered violently, the lights flickering. But the hull held steady for now, shields at 20%. Yarrow warned, his voice tinged with panic. The first of the Trathan warships was in her sights, and Holt knew this was their chance. They had to end it now, before the Aurora was torn apart in the crossfire. She aimed the ship directly toward the command deck of the enemy flagship, their weak spot. She knew it better than anyone, and if they could strike it, they might be able to disable their entire fleet. Focusing all power on the forward cannons, she unleashed a torrent of concentrated fire. The blasts pounded against the enemy warship's weak defenses, but the Trathans had reinforced it in anticipation of a human counterattack. They'd expected this. Holt grinned grimly. The Trathans always underestimated the humans, always assumed that they would fall when the going got tough. But Holt had never been the type to quit when faced with overwhelming odds. Humans fought harder when cornered, and they fought smarter. Holt pushed the Aurora into a steep climb, pulling the ship away from the barrage of fire. Just as the Trathans retaliated, a perfect distraction, giving them the opening they needed. They wouldn't get a second chance. As the ship soared above the battlefield, she turned and aimed straight down at the exposed underside of the Trathan flagship. Her crew watched as she steadied the ship for the final strike. All weapons ready, Yarrow said breathlessly. Hold on, Captain. This is going to be close. She gave him a tight nod. All or nothing now. The Aurora's main guns fired in unison, sending a devastating volley of shots into the heart of the Trathan flagship. The massive ship shuddered as explosions erupted from its core. For a moment, there was silence before the enormous vessel split apart in a fiery ball of debris. The crew watched in awe as the Trathans began to retreat, but Holt knew this battle was far from won. They had made their mark, but the war was just beginning. The destruction of the Trathan flagship sent shockwaves through the battlefield. The enemy fleet had been thrown into disarray. For a brief moment, they hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Holt could see the fear in their movements, their perfectly synchronized formations faltering as they tried to regroup and retaliate. But Holt knew better than to believe it was over. The Trathans were calculating and ruthless, and they would regroup quickly. The Aurora was far from invincible, and their shields were already on the verge of collapse. Holt's hand tightened on the controls as she pulled the ship into another evasive maneuver. The hull creaked under the strain, but it held together. The crew was shaken, but their resolve remained unbroken. Now they had to use the chaos to their advantage. The Trathans wouldn't expect a follow-up attack. Not this soon. She turned to Yarrow. We hit them now. While they're confused, get me the coordinates for the next target. Yarrow nodded swiftly, his eyes glued to the sensors, his fingers moving rapidly across the console. Captain, we've got a secondary target, the Trathan supply ship, on the outer edge of their fleet. If we destroy it, we cut off their reinforcements. We can keep them from regrouping. Holt's mind raced. The Trathans had no concept of mercy. They would stop at nothing to crush them. If the supply ship went down, it would slow the enemy's offensive significantly, but getting to it wouldn't be easy. Their position was exposed, and any move they made would bring them straight into the heart of the remaining enemy forces. She knew it was a risk, a dangerous one, but they had no choice. They either struck now or risked being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Holt took a deep breath. Do it, she ordered. Hit the supply ship and get out before the Trathans can retaliate. Yarrow input the coordinates, and the Aurora surged forward, cutting through the void at breakneck speed. Holt's pulse quickened as the target grew closer. They were on the edge of the enemy's defenses, and any misstep would mean their destruction. But there was no turning back now. The Trathan fighters scattered as they noticed their approach, but the Aurora was already on them, too fast for their heavier ships to intercept. Holt could feel the surge of adrenaline in her chest as they closed in on the supply ship. She gave the order to fire, and the ship's weapons rose to life. A barrage of concentrated fire slammed into the supply ship's hull. The explosion sent shockwaves through space. The ship rocked violently as the supply ship disintegrated in a ball of fire. The Aurora's sensors flickered as the enemy fleet tried to recover, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The Trathans were scrambling to reorganize, and their reinforcements had been cut off. Holt quickly turned the ship around, ready to make their escape. But the Trathans were not done yet. They weren't going to let them leave that easily. Incoming fighters on our tail, Yarrow warned, his voice strained. They've launched everything they've got. Holt's jaw tightened. She pushed the Aurora into a sharp turn, but the enemy was on them. The Trathan fighters came in from all directions, firing relentlessly at the Aurora. Holt could hear the ship's hull groaning under the assault shields. At 10%, she heard one of the crew members shout, But there was no time to worry about that now. They had to get out of this alive. Holt engaged every evasive maneuver she could think of, weaving the ship through a chaotic dance of explosions and gunfire. The crew held on as the ship bucked and rolled through the hostile environment. But the Trathans were closing in. They had no intention of letting the humans escape. Yarrow was at her side as she steered the ship, his voice tight with urgency. "Captain, we can't keep this up for much longer. They're too close. We need a way out." Holt's mind raced. She knew they couldn't outrun the enemy, not with their shields failing and the Trathan fighters gaining on them. Then it hit her, a plan born out of desperation and survival. She locked eyes with Yarrow and gave him a grim smile. "I've got an idea. It's risky, but it's our only shot," she said. "We're going to punch through their lines and use the debris from the supply ship as cover. Hold on tight." She slammed the ship forward into a controlled dive, taking the Aurora directly into the heart of the Trathan forces. The maneuver was insane, but it gave them the split second they needed. As the Trathan ships scattered to avoid the debris, the Aurora shot through the gap, breaking free of their pursuers. But Holt knew this wouldn't last long. They were out of immediate danger, but the war was far from over. The Aurora blasted through the debris field, the ship's engines whining as it pushed forward at maximum speed. The Trathan fleet was still out there somewhere, but for now they were free. Holt's heart pounded in her chest. She knew the escape had been too close. They couldn't afford to be so reckless again. But the risk had paid off. They were alive for the moment, but Holt knew better than to think they had won this battle. The Trathans were relentless, and their forces were far from depleted. She looked around at her crew, their faces pale, but resolute. They had survived the first wave, but there would be more, and they would have to be ready. She turned to Yarrow, who was already at his post. "Captain, the fleet's pulled back for now, but I'm detecting new ships approaching from the outer rim." Holt's stomach churned. "How many this time?" Yarrow hesitated as he ran the numbers. "Too many," he said. "The entire fleet is regrouping. They're coming after us with everything they have. We can't keep running." Holt looked at the tactical display. The numbers were staggering. They were outmatched and outgunned. There was no question about that. She ran a hand through her hair, frustration and fear clawing at her mind. But there was one thing the Trathans had never counted on, and that was human ingenuity. She stood tall and turned to face her crew. "We have one more chance to turn this around. We can't outrun them, but we can outsmart them," she said. Yarrow's eyes narrowed. "What do you have in mind?" Captain Holt moved to the command table and activated a map of the surrounding sector. "If we can get close to the asteroid belt at the edge of the system, we might be able to hide among the rocks long enough to regroup and launch a counteroffensive. It won't be easy, but it's our best shot." Yarrow didn't hesitate. He set the course for the asteroid belt, and the Aurora began its slow retreat toward the cover of the rocky field. They were dangerously close to the enemy fleet, but Holt was confident that the Trathans wouldn't be able to track them in the dense asteroid field. If they could remain undetected long enough, they might be able to regroup and launch a surprise attack. Holt watched the crew work in silence, the tension thick in the air. They all knew the stakes, and none of them were willing to give up. They had survived impossible odds before, and they would do it again. The first few moments of the retreat were nerve-wracking. The Aurora glided silently through the void, narrowly avoiding the incoming Trathan ships. The asteroid belt was close now, just a few more minutes, and they could use the cover to hide. The ship's sensors were pinging with activity as the enemy fleet searched for any sign of their position. But Holt trusted the stealth capabilities of the Aurora. She knew they could make it if they played it right. But then came the first problem. A small Trathan scout ship appeared on the outer edge of the asteroid field. It had somehow detected their position. Holt's breath caught in her throat as she watched it approach. The scout ship was no match for the Aurora, but if it called for reinforcements, their cover would be blown. Yarrow's voice broke the silence. "We need to take it out before it can alert the fleet." Holt didn't hesitate. "Take it out," she ordered. "But be quick, we don't have much time." The crew sprung into action, and within moments, the Aurora had turned to face the scout ship, weapons primed. Holt braced herself as the ship fired in rapid succession. The scout ship didn't stand a chance as the blasts hit their target. The small vessel disintegrated in a burst of flame. Holt exhaled slowly as the ship's wreckage drifted into the asteroid field. But they were far from safe. She knew the Trathans would send more ships to investigate the sudden silence that had fallen over the battlefield. But they had bought themselves precious time. They had to move quickly now. As they navigated deeper into the asteroid field, Holt stared out at the endless void, wondering how much longer they could keep this up. The Aurora drifted deeper into the asteroid field. The dense clouds of rocks and debris obscured their presence. But Holt knew it wouldn't last long. The Trathans would search the area with every resource they had. They couldn't hide forever. But for now, the asteroid field gave them a temporary reprieve. Holt stood at the command center, eyes fixed on the display, as she watched the enemy fleet spread out on the sensors. They were looking for any sign of movement, hoping to catch them off guard. But Holt had another plan. The asteroid field was dense and filled with dangerous rocks and unstable gravity wells. If they could navigate it carefully enough, they could use it to their advantage. Yarrow, she called. Without turning from the display, set the ship on a zigzag course through the belt. We need to make sure they don't have a clear shot at us. Yarrow was already on it, his fingers flying over the controls as the Aurora swerved sharply to the left, narrowly avoiding a large asteroid that drifted past their hull. Holt watched the ship's shields flicker as debris impacted the outer layer, but the ship held steady. The crew's faces were tight with concentration. Everyone knew the stakes. They couldn't afford a single mistake. Holt's mind raced as she watched the Trathans' movements on the tactical map. They had split into smaller groups likely to sweep the asteroid field systematically. They were calculating, but Holt knew that they weren't used to this kind of terrain. This was humanity's edge. The Trathans thought in terms of brute force, while humans thrived on adaptability. It was time to use that advantage. She turned to Yarrow again. Prepare a surprise maneuver, she said. We need to hit them hard while they're divided and disoriented. Yarrow gave a quick nod and set the coordinates for the maneuver. Holt's hand hovered over the comms console, and she addressed her crew. This is it. We make our move now. Get ready. Holt's heart raced as she gave the order to execute the maneuver. The Aurora shot forward, using the asteroid field as a shield for their attack. The Trathans hadn't expected the human ship to come out of nowhere so fast, and in such tight quarters. The Aurora burst from behind a large asteroid, sending a barrage of fire toward one of the Trathan groups that was closest to them. The enemy ships scattered in chaos as the sudden attack took them off guard. Two of the Trathan's smaller ships were torn apart in the explosion. The remaining fighters scrambled to form a defensive perimeter. But it was too late. The Aurora had already pulled back into the cover of the asteroids before the Trathans could retaliate. Holt exhaled slowly as she watched the enemy regroup. But this time they were disorganized. They had lost their advantage, and Holt had just given her crew the opening they needed. Yarrow punched the controls again. Captain, they're scrambling to organize. They're not sure where we are right now. This is our chance. Holt didn't need another word. She gave the order to push forward again, this time with a different target in mind. There was one thing the Trathans didn't expect, and that was a direct attack on their command ship. If they could take it out, the rest of the fleet would fall apart. She turned to the tactical display. It was a gamble, but they had no choice. Yarrow plotted the course, and the Aurora rocketed forward. Once more, this time, the Trathans weren't ready. Their fleet was too disorganized, and their fighters were too scattered to stop them. The Aurora closed in on the Trathan command ship, weapons primed and ready for the kill. Holt's fingers trembled as she prepared to give the order. She couldn't afford to hesitate. They were too close now. The Trathans began to react. Just as the Aurora unleashed its firepower directly onto the command ship, the enemy flagship erupted into flames, debris flying everywhere as the Aurora tore through its defenses. But before the crew could celebrate, a warning blade from the ship's console. We've got incoming fire from the remaining fleet, Yarrow said sharply. The Trathans were retaliating. Holt gritted her teeth. They had hit the command ship hard. But it wasn't over yet. The Trathans would come after them with everything they had. Holt knew it was only a matter of time before they regrouped. But they had to push forward. They couldn't afford to wait now. Turn the ship around. Get us out of here, Holt commanded. Yarrow didn't need to be told. He immediately spun the ship into a sharp maneuver, and they dove into the asteroid field once more. But this time they weren't alone. The Trathan ships had regrouped and were closing in fast. The Aurora plunged into the asteroid field again, its engines roaring. As it dodged incoming fire from the Trathan fleet, the ship's hull vibrated with each impact. But it held steady. Holt's heart raced as she watched the enemy ships close in. The Trathans had learned quickly from their earlier mistakes, and now they were more coordinated than ever. Their fighters swarmed the field like a storm, and the larger warships were moving in to block the exits. Holt's mind worked frantically, searching for an opening. She glanced at the tactical display and saw that the asteroid field was starting to thin out the closer they got to the system's edge. It was a trap. The Trathans were boxing them in. But she wouldn't give up now. She couldn't. Holt turned to Yarrow. "Give me a full power boost to the engines. We need to outrun them," she said, her voice tight with determination. Yarrow's hands flew across the console, activating the ship's boosters. The Aurora surged forward faster than it had ever moved before. The Trathans were on their tail. But Holt could feel the strain. The ship groaned under the pressure, and the shields were flickering dangerously low. But they had to keep moving. They had to escape. Holt's eyes darted back to the display as she saw the first of the Trathan warships move to block their escape route. The situation was getting worse by the second. "Captain, we can't keep this up much longer," Yarrow said, his voice tense. "We're pushing the ship too hard. The hull's integrity is at risk." Holt didn't have time to worry about that now. They were trapped, and if they didn't break free now, it would be over. She took a deep breath, then turned back to her crew. "All hands brace for impact," she ordered. The crew braced themselves for the worst, but Holt's mind was focused on the plan she had in mind. She couldn't afford to hesitate. She had to be decisive. The ship's sensors were picking up a cluster of unstable asteroids up ahead. If they could reach it, they could use it to make a break for it. But it would be a gamble. They would have to navigate the field with precision and speed. And if they miscalculated, they would be lost in the chaos. Holt's fingers gripped the controls as she made the decision to go for it. "We're taking the risk now," she said with finality. She yanked the ship's controls hard to the left, pushing the Aurora directly into the unstable asteroid cluster. The Trathans were hot on their tail, and they wouldn't be far behind. But Holt knew she had to use every advantage she had. The asteroid field was dense and erratic, but it was their only shot at survival. The ship shuddered as they navigated through the field. The sound of the hull groaning under the impact of flying debris rang in their ears. Holt's hands shook as she expertly steered the ship between the massive asteroids, dodging the larger rocks and weaving through the smaller ones. It was a dangerous maneuver, but they were still alive. The Trathans had no choice but to follow. But their larger ships were struggling to keep up. The tighter the field got, the more their firepower became ineffective. Holt's breath caught in her throat as she spotted a narrow opening ahead. It was a perfect gap, a way out of the field if they could make it through. Holt hit the thrusters, sending the ship surging forward at breakneck speed. The Aurora rocketed toward the opening. Just as the Trathan ships tried to close in around them, the gap was closing fast. But Holt was determined. She held her breath as the Aurora sped toward it, the gap narrowing to nothing but a sliver of space. If they didn't get through it now, they would be trapped forever. Holt's grip tightened on the controls. This was it. She couldn't afford to fail. Suddenly, the Aurora lurched as it shot through the gap, the ship barely fitting through the narrow space. As the Trathan's ships collided with the surrounding asteroids, the explosive sounds of their impacts ringing in the distance. The Aurora shot out of the asteroid field and into open space. The crew let out a collective exhale. They had made it through, but Holt knew they couldn't slow down, yet the Trathans would regroup and follow them into open space. And now they were vulnerable to a full assault. They had survived, but at a cost, and Holt could feel the weight of it press on her shoulders. This wasn't over yet. It had only just begun. The Aurora shot through open space, the black void stretching endlessly before them. Holt knew they had a small window of time before the Trathans could fully regroup and track them. They had to make the most of it, but the ship was running on fumes. The power reserves were dangerously low, and the damage from the battle had taken its toll. Holt could see it in the eyes of her crew. They were exhausted, but they were far from done. They had made it this far, and they would keep fighting. Holt turned to Yarrow. "Get me a full scan of the surrounding area. See if there's any nearby systems we can jump to." Yarrow nodded, his face pale from the stress, but his hands moved quickly over the console, scanning the area for anything that could offer a chance at escape. After a few tense moments, he spoke. "Captain, there's a planet nearby, not far from here. It's not on any of our charts. It's an uninhabited world, but it has a few moons and some atmospheric activity. We could hide there for a while. Holt nodded sharply. Do it. Set a course for the planet. We can restock and make repairs while we regroup. But be quick, the Trathans won't give us much time. Yarrow's fingers flew over the controls, and the ship's engines hummed as it changed course toward the unknown planet. Holt's mind raced as they made their way through space. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would give them a chance to breathe a brief respite before the next fight. The crew moved about the ship, preparing for what lay ahead. The quiet hum of the engines was the only sound in the command center. Holt watched the planet draw closer on the screen. It was a small world, far from the major trade routes, and outside the reach of most major military forces. It had been largely ignored by all but the most desperate travelers. But that made it perfect for what they needed. Holt could feel the tension in the air as the ship entered the planet's atmosphere, the sensors flickering. As they passed through the upper layers of the atmosphere, the ship shook under the pressure. But Holt gritted her teeth and held steady. Captain, we're entering the upper atmosphere. Yarrow said, his voice tight with concentration. Keep us steady. We don't have much room to maneuver. Holt ordered. The Aurora groaned as it descended through the thick clouds. The landscape below them was rocky and jagged, large mountains rising up from the barren surface. Holt could see faint traces of storms moving across the surface, but nothing to indicate any immediate danger. The Aurora plunged lower into the atmosphere, the clouds swirling around them. As they approached a large canyon system, Holt's eyes narrowed. This would be the perfect place to hide. The narrow passageways and sharp turns would make it difficult for the Trathans to track them, even if they found their way to the planet. She turned to the crew. Prepare to land. We'll make repairs and restock as quickly as possible, she said. We won't have long. Yarrow's hands moved quickly across the controls as he set the ship down in the canyon. The Aurora touched down with a soft thud, the ship's engines humming. As it powered down, the crew began to move quickly, gathering supplies and preparing to make necessary repairs. Holt stood up from her seat, her eyes scanning the outside world through the ship's windows. The planet was silent and desolate, but it offered them what they needed, a temporary refuge. They could only hope it would be enough. Holt turned to her officers. We've got a small window of time to work with, so let's make it count. We need to repair the shields and restore power to the weapon systems before the Trathans catch up with us. Any questions? She glanced at Yarrow. He shook his head. No questions, Captain. The team is ready to move out. Holt gave a short nod as the crew began to disperse outside the ship. The atmosphere was thick and difficult to breathe, but they had to make do. The planet was not hospitable, but it was shelter for now. The rest of the crew followed orders and began working on repairs. Holt's mind never strayed far from the battle ahead. She knew the Trathans wouldn't stop hunting them, not after everything they had done. Holt moved to the rear of the ship and began checking the systems, personally making sure every last component was functioning at peak performance. But even as she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. They couldn't afford to stay on this planet for long. It was only a matter of time before the Trathans found them again. Holt worked through the repairs, her hands moving swiftly over the controls as she checked the ship's systems. One by one, the crew was moving just as quickly outside in the canyon. But the time was running out. Every minute they spent here brought them closer to being discovered. Holt could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on her. The planet was quiet for now, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. The Trathans were relentless, and they would scour the entire system if they had to find them. Holt's mind raced with the possibilities. They couldn't stay hidden much longer, but there was no other choice. They had to make repairs and get back in the fight. Holt stood up from the console, her muscles aching from the long hours of work. She turned and walked to the front of the ship, looking out at the barren canyon that surrounded them. It was silent except for the distant rumble of thunder in the atmosphere. The crew was focused on their tasks, but Holt couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the air felt charged, as if something was waiting in the silence. Holt's instincts were screaming at her to stay alert. She turned and walked to the command center. Yarrow was seated at the console, his eyes fixed on the sensors. Captain, we've got movement, he said, his voice tight with tension. Holt's heart skipped a beat. What kind of movement? She asked quickly. It's not Trathan ships, Yarrow said. It's something else. There are small crafts coming from the planet's surface. They're moving in our direction. Holt's eyes widened. What are they? Yarrow's fingers flew over the controls, his eyes scanning the incoming data. They're not showing up On any of our scans, it's hard to say, but they're moving fast, too fast to be ordinary transports. Holt didn't hesitate, set a defensive perimeter. Now she ordered. Yarrow nodded sharply as the ship's weapon systems powered up. The crew on the ground scrambled to get back to the ship. As the small craft approached from below, Holt's grip tightened on the armrest. What the hell was going on, she muttered to herself. Why would anyone be coming here? The planet was uninhabited. It was far from any major trade routes, and no one in their right mind would venture here with the Trathons hunting them down. Then she saw it, a small flash of light from one of the crafts. As it moved closer to their position, Yarrow's voice broke her thoughts. Captain, the small craft are entering our range. They're not Trathons, they're human. Holt's eyes widened. The realization hit her like a freight train. Human ships in this remote part of the galaxy. But why were they here? What did they want? Yarrow, keep scanning them. Get me everything you can find on them. Holt said, her mind racing. The incoming ships were closing in rapidly now. There was no time for caution. The crew was already on high alert. The atmosphere inside the Aurora was tense as everyone prepared for a possible confrontation. The small crafts grew closer now. They could make out the shapes of the ships. They weren't anything like the Trathon vessels. In fact, they looked almost archaic, primitive in comparison to the advanced technology of the Trathons. But still functional. Holt could feel the uncertainty ripple through the crew, who were now standing by ready for orders. What do we do? Captain Yarrow asked, his voice tight. Holt looked out at the small fleet of ships as they moved into view. They were human. But who were they? Holt had never seen ships like these before, and she certainly didn't know anyone who would risk coming this far into Trathon-controlled space. Holt's eyes narrowed. Something wasn't adding up. Yarrow, keep scanning them. I need to know if these ships are hostile, or if we've just found some kind of allies, she said. The crew continued to watch the ships approach, their weapons at the ready. Holt's thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. They had to make a choice now. There was no time left to wait. Either these ships were a threat, or they could be a lifeline for the crew. But Holt wasn't about to let her guard down just yet. The tension inside the Aurora was palpable as the unknown ships moved closer, their engines humming softly. As they approached, Holt stood motionless, staring at the display, her mind racing with possibilities. Who were these humans? What were they doing so far from any known human colonies? And why had they come here? Was it a trap? Or could they actually be the allies they so desperately needed? Yarrow was still scanning the incoming ships, the hum of the ship's systems the only sound in the command center. Captain, I'm getting a signal, he said, his voice tight with anticipation. Holt didn't hesitate. Open the channel, she ordered. Yarrow nodded, and within moments, the screen flickered to life, revealing a figure in a worn-out military uniform. The face was hard to read. Age and stress had worn it down, but there was no mistaking the resolve in the eyes of the man before her. Captain Holt, I presume. The voice was gruff and commanding. Holt's breath caught in her throat. Who are you? She asked, her voice steady. Despite the swirling uncertainty, the man's lips twisted into a tight smile. We've been tracking you for a while now, he said. We know who you are and what you've been through. Holt's heart skipped a beat. We're not the only ones fighting this war, he continued. We've got a small resistance force spread out across the galaxy. We've been keeping tabs on the Trathons for months, and we've been looking for a way to join forces with you, but we couldn't risk exposing ourselves until we were sure the Trathons weren't listening. Holt blinked, her mind spinning with the implications. A resistance force. But why here? Why now? The man continued. We've been tracking the movements of the Trathons, and we've seen your fight with them. We know you've lost a lot, but we believe we can help you finish what you started. Holt narrowed her eyes. But why didn't you contact us sooner? We've been fighting this war alone for too long. He leaned forward slightly, a weary sigh escaping his lips. We couldn't risk it, he said. We've got spies in some of the worst places in the galaxy, and if the Trathons caught wind of us, we'd be finished. But now that we've seen your determination, we're willing to risk it. We need to unite our forces and take down the Trathons once and for all. Holt processed the information. It was hard to believe. After all they had been through, she had grown used to the idea of fighting alone. But here was this stranger offering help at a time when they were so close to defeat. Her mind fought against the idea, but something deep down told her to trust him. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her shoulders. The fate of her crew, the future of the war, it all depended on what they did next. If these people were truly who they said they were, they could be the key to turning the tide against the Trathons. If not, they would just be another enemy to fight. She glanced at Yarrow, who met her gaze with a look of quiet understanding. Holt turned back to the screen and spoke again. "We'll need more than just words if you want us to trust you," she said. "We're not going into this blindly." The man's eyes softened for a moment. "I understand," he said. "We've got a safe location nearby. We can meet you there and discuss everything in detail. But we need to act fast. The Trathans have been expanding their search in this sector, and we won't have much time." Holt took a deep breath. Everything in her screamed to be cautious. But she knew that they had no other choice. They had to act now, before the Trathans closed in on them again. She looked at her crew. They were ready for anything. They had survived so much already, and they would keep fighting. Holt turned back to the man on the screen. "Make the jump, and we'll meet you there," she said. "We'll need to move quickly, but we'll be there." The man's face lit up with a look of relief. "Understood," he said. "We'll wait for you. We'll be ready." Holt gave a sharp nod and turned to Yarrow. "Set a course for the coordinates he just gave us," she ordered. Yarrow complied without hesitation, and within moments, the Aurora powered up its engines. Once more, the crew's eyes were fixed on the mission ahead. They didn't know what awaited them at the meeting point, but Holt knew that this could be the turning point in their fight against the Trathans. They had just been given a chance to unite with something greater than themselves, a chance to finally fight back on their own terms. Holt's hands gripped the controls as the ship surged forward into the unknown. But this time she didn't feel the weight of uncertainty. Instead, she felt the fire of hope stirring within her for the first time in a long while. They were not alone.